Welcome back, sports fans, to the Steel Scorpion Sports Pre-Draft Podcast. That's right, Mark and the Milman returning to you live on a Saturday night during the third preseason games of the preseason schedule to give you tips and tricks for your upcoming fantasy football drafts and to touch on a few of the issues that we have with some of the fantasy sites prior to your drafts. Mark, welcome. How's everything up in Santa Clara?
Going well. No complaints.
That's great to hear. It's hot as heck down here in San Diego, and I know when someone in San Diego complains, it really holds a lot of weight. But I will say, I think I saw 100 degrees on a thermometer today. That's warm. I think regardless of where you live, that's warm. So,
You
lucky.
guys have basically near perfect weather year round, so I don't want to hear crap.
As I said, when someone in San Diego complains, it usually falls on deaf ears. With that, let's jump right into something else that makes you not want to listen or is near and dear to your ranting heart. And that's some of the websites out there that, one in particular, that may have some outdated or erroneously labeled items that you wanted to address. So, with that, Mark, take it away.
I have a little mini rant on ESPN. They consider themselves the worldwide leader, and they do have quite a lot of content and focus on fantasy, and that's great. And I do read or hear some of it, but I find it laughable that they are still calling a standard league one that is non-PPR, even though most leagues nowadays in 2015 have some aspect of PPR, whether it's half point PPR or three-quarter point PPR, full point PPR. I've even started hearing leagues that have 2-point PPR, which I think is a little bit crazy. That's way slanted towards wide receivers. That's why we use a half point at Steel Scorpion, because it kind of makes a nice even balance between running backs and receivers. But anyway, they call it a standard league, non-PPR, and 10 teams. And I think that's just crazy. First of all, 10 teams, I think, is kind of small. I think you're building all-star teams at that point. And I think, by and large, if you go ask people, like, what kind of league do you play in, if you do a survey of, everyone that plays fantasy, I'm going to venture to say that probably 80% of leagues are 12-team leagues. There are even some people that play in, like, 14 or 16-team leagues, which, tilts it more towards kind of very difficult to get some good teams together. But 12 is a standard. Some form of PPR is a standard, and yet, according to ESPN, a standard league is not PPR 10 points. So I think they're living in the past. I think they're still, watching their movies on VHS tapes and talking to each other on their Blackberries, and they're not with the times. They need to wake up, look around, see what's going on.
Well, that's a very good point, Mark. I'm just taking some notes here on my PDA. I think a lot of people still use this, right? No?
No.
Good.
Everybody,
Good. No, if you'll hang on, I got to get my rotary phone out and call my friends at ESPN on my landline to tell them about your rant. And then I'm hopeful that they'll, hear you and maybe move from the 1980s into at least the year 2000-ish range on a lot of their analysis, not just in fantasy, but think about their baseball voting for awards. I mean, from what you tell me, if they believe a 10-team non-PPR is standard for fantasy, they probably still believe that wins is the most important stat for Cy Young award voting. What do you think?
They probably do. They probably just look at total wins, and that's who they vote for. And they're like, what's this ERA thing? What's this WHIP? What's this adjusted ERA plus? What's this batting average in play? Like, all foreign concepts to them. And while we're on ranting about ESPN, I have another mini rant as well. With the latest news of Martavis Bryant being suspended, they were recently talking about that. And I won't say specifically who said this, but we'll say his name rhymes with Bobbert Morez. And he was saying that Martavius Bryant was suspended, which I had to see if maybe that was someone else in the NFL that I hadn't heard of, because there is no player in the NFL named Martavius Bryant. There's no U in his name. Get his name right. It's Martavis Bryant.
Well, do you think maybe there's no player named Martavius Bryant because he's been suspended?
No, I was looking at a list of all players, whether active, inactive, IR, etc. And I understand that Martavius may be kind of more of a common name than Martavis. I have to admit I've never heard of any Martavises until Martavis Bryant, but it doesn't make a difference. That's his name. Call him by his actual name. Like you work for ESPN. You're in the business of fantasy football. You would think you would know this guy's name.
Yeah, you'd think Robert Flores would know that. Oh, shoot, I should.
Oh, you were able to see through my. Oh man.
I was able to see through your ruse and call him by his real name. My bad. Bobbert Morris. Yes, if you were paid to host a podcast, and one of the topics on your podcast was going to be talking about a player suspended that day, I think you might know his name. Especially, it's not that you mention it once, because as you and I both having listened to this, he drops the name 3, 4, 5 times. So it wasn't like he said it once and just happened to stumble and say it wrong.
Right.
That happens. Hey, I'm okay with that. It's the fact that the third or fourth time you're still referring to an incorrect name, and that clearly is saying that's you have in your mind that's his name.
Yeah, it's bad.
All right, well, let's move from bad to good then, because I think while ESPN might be what we like to refer to as the bad now, they call themselves the worldwide leader, but in their mind, 10 teams, non-PPR, great. That's the worldwide leader of crap. Steel Scorpion Sports, we're the worldwide leader in awesomeness because we have the mulligan, the multiplier, the all-play format, and we know this is a key time for all fantasy players, right? It's the week before your draft, the week of your draft. So with 2 weeks to go prior to the start of the NFL season, we wanted to drop some knowledge on you. So we're going to give you 10 tips to take into your fantasy draft. Now use these at your own discretion. I know everyone has their own idiosyncrasies. We even play Mark with a few people that they will overdraft a player from their favorite team just so they have them on their team. I'm not going to tell you not to do that. If you are in love with the Buffalo Bills and you want Fred Jackson, well, good for you. Figure out where you're going to get him and draft him. But these are going to be more general tips that if you utilize, we think that they do help you build a stronger roster. So, Mark, why don't you lead us off with your first tip for fantasy drafts?
Well, before I do, speaking of what you just said, like you and I are drafting in a league against each other less than 24 hours from now. So I do have one tip that kind of relates to a specific player, but I'm not going to actually be able to give him his name because then you'll snipe him from me in our draft. So I'm going to try to do that as generically as possible and still give that tip. But my first tip is stretch before your draft. I don't mean that literally, but I do want you to be flexible. I don't want you to go into your draft with a very rigid, specific plan. Like, I'm going to start off running back, receiver, running back. And that's how my first 5 rounds are going to go. It's fine to go in your draft thinking that you're roughly going to try to target those positions in the first 5 rounds, but things change. You don't know exactly how the draft's going to go. You might find some unexpected choices that happen during the draft, and then there's players there that you didn't think would be there. You have to be willing to pivot and take those players instead. So just make sure you don't go with a rigid plan that you're unwilling to move from. Be flexible, see how things develop, and adjust from there. So that's my first tip.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with that. For example, I have the 10th selection in the draft you mentioned tomorrow night. So if I went in with that rigid mindset and said, I'm getting a running back in round 1, that sounds all well and good, but if 9 running backs go in front of me, maybe I should be looking at the top wide receiver on the board or the top tight end or the top QB, because clearly the 10th best running back might not be the best selection in the first round. So, good point there. So for my first tip, though, I may have just said if 9 running backs go, you can look at the top wide receiver, the top quarterback, or the top tight end. But I'm actually going to recommend avoid tight end in the first round, probably in the first 2 rounds. Especially as I look at this year's draft. That means you're not going to get Gronk. You're not going to get Jimmy Graham. I'm not even sure Jimmy Graham should be the second tight end drafted. But the reason I say this isn't because I don't like Gronk or Jimmy Graham, but unless you get a ridiculous tight end scoring bonus, and Mark, I know you've seen leagues where a tight end gets 1.5 PPR or maybe 2 PPR, as you mentioned. If that's the case, take a tight end. I'm okay with that. But if I'm sitting at 10 tomorrow and some running backs and a receiver or two go, and I take a tight end at number 10, I'm going to be chasing running back or receiver the rest of the draft because as you mentioned, the flexibility piece, I've just taken flexibility out of being able to draft the rest of the night. Because now if Travis Kelce or Greg Olsen or someone slides to me in round 4 or 5, I'm not taking him because I took Gronk. So that's my advice. Don't take a tight end in round 1 or round 2, depending on where you draft in round 2. But
yeah, I like that. I approach most of my drafts the same way. I tend to wait on both QB and tight end. And actually, that your point leads right into my next one. So the third one is my tip is that if you do end up drafting a QB or tight end anywhere in the top 4 to 5 rounds, don't waste a roster spot later on drafting a backup. Because if you do take a QB or tight end in the first 4 to 5 rounds, you're already getting one of the premium ones. Any QB in the top 4 to 5 rounds, you're getting probably either Rodgers, Luck, Wilson. Maybe that's it. I don't think there's based on ADP. Like maybe you're reaching for Big Ben in round 5 or something like that. And again, tight ends in the first 4 to 5 rounds, you're pretty much looking at Gronk and Graham. That's it. Personally, I'm not even touching Graham this year with that in the new offense he's in. Seattle is going to be bucking more. He's not going to get near as many receptions. But if he's number 2 on your list, you probably have to take him in the first 4 or 5 rounds. So if you have either of those positions in the first 4 or 5 rounds, do not draft a backup. You use a premium pick on that position. Don't get another one later because you're planning on starting that player every single week of the season, other than their bye, of course. You're hoping that they're not going to get injured. If they do, you'll go and get someone off of the waiver wire. And this tip is, of course, based on standard bench sizes. You know, most leagues have bench sizes that are fairly small, I think, usually around 5 or 6. If you're in a league with deep benches, then, of course, you can draft a backup QB or tight end. But in general, based on most league sizes, I wouldn't do it. I'd rather fill my roster with running backs and receivers and get one that might pop, get one that might explode, like a C.J. Anderson or a Justin Forsett or Odell Beckham Jr. from last year. You're much better trying to get one of those guys than a backup tight end that you're never ever going to play other than the bye week.
that's a good point. I would want to make one caveat there, though, for those that play on Steel Scorpion Sports leagues. Because of the multiplier, I would say getting a backup QB is not a bad idea. And I'll tell you why, which is my next point, is if you're playing in a Steel Scorpion Sports league, take a flyer on an injury or suspension backup and remember to multiply them in the early weeks of the season. For example, Jimmy Garoppolo, he's likely to be playing the first 1, 2, 3, 4 games. Hopefully by the time you draft, we'll know the outcome of Brady's suspension, but we may not. If you took a flyer on Garoppolo and Brady does sit out, multiply Garoppolo early in the season when you know he's going to play. Same would go for Wheaton up in Pittsburgh. You know, I believe he is going to be the suspension replacement for Martavius Bryant.
I knew you were going to go there.
I hope I got that right.
Yeah.
Or you could even use Ladarius Green, who's going to be the 4-game suspension backup for Antonio Gates out here in San Diego. So at tight end, you can find some values like that, and in Steel Scorpion leagues, you'll find them later in the draft. Definitely grab them if you're going to multiply them in the first 1, 2, 3, or 4 weeks of the season. So that is my advice, is do take flyers in a Steel Scorpion Sports League on injury or suspension backups, and remember to multiply them early. What is terribly funny to me is when somebody does draft Garoppolo or someone like that, and they have him on the bench. But then they also drafted, as you mentioned, a better quarterback. And that quarterback starts off hot. They have Philip Rivers from a couple years ago, and he starts off like gangbusters. They're like, well, I don't want to bench Philip Rivers. Well, then you really wasted that draft pick, and you're not going to get the value of multiplying Garoppolo. So you got to play within your rules, people.
Yeah, no, I like that one. And one thing that I would add to that as far as multiplier strategy, if for some reason you fell asleep at the wheel and drafted Darren McFadden to your team, or maybe you thought it was, 2009 or 10, whenever it was, he had that one halfway decent season. Anyway, if he ends up on your roster, if at any point during the season, and it may not be week 1, maybe it's week 2, whatever, if at any point during the season he's fully healthy, multiply it. Because let me tell you, that might be your only chance. Because after that, he's going to be injured. He's going to be listed as probable or doubtful for the rest of the season. You're still going to not want to cut him because you're thinking, it's Darren McFadden. Like, he was, a first-round pick. He has talent. I remember seeing him in Arkansas. Like, you're not going to want to cut him. But you're never going to play him either because he's going to be listed as, like I said, probable or doubtful every single week. So the 1 week that he's healthy, multiply.
Yeah, Carson Palmer falls in that too. Early in the season, multiply him because by week 10 he's probably going to be hurt. So
yeah, might have a third ACL injury by then. Tip number 5. This is one that hopefully you've seen before. It gets reiterated every year. I'm going to do my PSA and make sure to reiterate it now. I strongly believe in this. Draft only one defense and one kicker. Don't you dare draft a backup at either of those positions. Even if you, in this case, even if you really do have pretty deep benches, you're still better off using, getting running backs and receivers and maybe a tight end for those spots. Do not, by any means, draft a second kicker or defense, and wait till the very last 2 rounds. You should be drafting your kicker in the second to last round, your defense in the second to last round, your kicker in the last round. There is one caveat to that. Now, in the draft that we have tomorrow night, I have the first pick in the draft, which means I also have the very last pick of the draft. Now, let's say there is a flyer, kind of a lottery ticket that I'm targeting that I don't think anyone else is going to take. His ADP is much lower, but I think he's going to have a big season. And this is where I can't give a name, but let's just say for the sake of argument that it's Jericho Cotchery. And I know that no one's going to take him. Now, in this case, I should probably draft my kicker with my 17th round pick, because at that point, I'm probably getting like the second or third kicker off the board. I can get one of the higher scoring ones with good offense. Whereas if I take Cotchery at that point, before I need to, then I'm going to get the 12th kicker off the board, maybe 13th if some moron took a backup kicker. So in this case, I should actually take the kicker in the 17th round and wait for the lottery ticket later. But in general, one kicker, one defense in the second last round, kicker in the last round.
And I'd even add to that, if possible, target kickers and defenses with later buys, because that's the one thing I've heard from people as well. I grabbed a second defense or a second kicker because mine had a week 4 bye. Well, then don't draft one that has a week 4 bye, and don't feel like you need to have a backup anyway, even at that. But if that's going to be your rationale, find somebody that has a week 9 bye, because as you just noted, if I'm waiting until the last 2 rounds to get my kicker and defense, I'm basically saying they're mainly interchangeable pieces. Maybe Seattle and a few other defenses are not interchangeable, but they'll go before we would draft them anyway. But if where I'm drafting, if they're interchangeable, pick one with a later bye, and hey, you ignore that. And by the time week 8, 9 rolls around and your guy goes on by, you'll know what defense to pick up off of the waivers. That's my extension to your PSA.
I like it.
That was my after-school special portion of your after-school special.
Nice.
All right. So this one is going to sound completely crazy to you, but I believe in handcuffing running backs. And I say that, and I mean running backs as in Jamal Charles and maybe Eddie Lacy. And beyond that, not at all. The reason I bring up Jamal Charles and Eddie Lacy is they have running backs that I think if you did draft Davis or Starks to back them up, those guys actually would produce similar value in place of these guys and actually get some touches anyway. So there are chances that in a given week, if you had to throw them in because of a probable status on your starter, they would either replicate what they get, or even if they split carries, they get enough. Most running backs, however, as they're finding out in Houston, you take Arian Foster out and you put in Alfred Blue, he doesn't give you Arian Foster numbers. He gives you half of an Arian Foster. And if you took out Adrian Peterson in Minnesota, I don't care who you plug in, you're not going to get AP numbers. You're going to get McKinnon numbers, which are nice but not great. So if you drafted Peterson, don't waste a pick on those guys. Take a flyer on something else. It's such a small group that I could accept a handcuff on. I'm basically telling you not to handcuff.
Yeah, I basically like it. I've never been a huge fan of handcuffing, so I'm glad you're limiting it to just 2 players. I think, in general, people should only handcuff if they have fairly deep benches. And I think I'm still scoring we have 10 starters and 8 bench, which is fairly deep. Like, you can afford to draft a handcuff when you have 8 bench. If you have something like 10 starters and 6 bench, that's much shallower. It's hard to do that, and it really gets hard if you do, say, draft Charles and then now Davis. And then once the buys start hitting in weeks 4 and 5, and say you've got some buys coming through, and maybe you have a player that's doubtful for a week, like, I think you really get down to the crunch and say Charles is off to a good start, and you drafted this guy and you haven't used him yet, and now you have buys and injury sitting, and probably end up having to draft him to get a bye week fill in anyway. So I've never been a huge fan of handcuffing, but the 2 examples that you mentioned would be probably the best case scenarios. For the 7th tip, mine is if you're drafting near the turn, at either turn, so say you have say the 3 or 4 pick, or maybe the 9 or 10 pick, make sure to pay attention to the rosters of the teams behind you. They're going to have a few picks before it's back on you. So say you have the 9 pick, 10, 11, 12, those 3 teams are each going to make 2 picks before it gets back to you. And say you're in round 8 and you haven't taken a quarterback yet, and you're now starting to think, okay, I need to start thinking about when I'm going to take my quarterback. Before you take him in round 8, or say round 9, when you're going that way, and you look at the rosters of teams 10, 11, 12. Do they have quarterbacks yet? If they all have quarterbacks, then wait for them to make their double picks and quarterback around 10. Like, why take a player that none of those teams were going to take anyway? Instead, take a running back receiver that one of them might have sniped from you. So look at their rosters to see what positional needs they have when making your decision on what positions to take.
Yeah, we refer to that as playing the turn. And since I have the 10th pick tomorrow night, I just took notes off of your recommendation, so thank you. I'm going to use that strategy now.
As you should.
I may have been using it anyway, but definitely I'm using it now because there's nothing that screams beat Mark Heflin at his own game more than using his advice against him. And if I can give a... Go ahead.
We're very, very far apart in this draft, though, because I have the 1 pick, you have the 10th pick. So I can't even, you can take players that I want from me, but I won't even consider it sniping, because any player you take from me will be at least 9 picks away from my next pick, at which point any of the other 8 teams going to take him. So we're so far apart in this draft that I don't think we're going to be getting in each other's way.
No, that was my one caveat to your tip there, was that if you get the chance, definitely snipe picks from Mark Heflin. I don't think I'm going to get the chance, unfortunately, where I would grab someone and you would curse into the phone or you would bang on the keyboard because, like you said, I'll draft them and you might think, well, I kind of wanted that guy, but you weren't ready to draft him anyway because you knew there were 9 other teams that were going to step in and grab him. So darn it.
Yep.
There goes my fun. But my tip to everyone else is if you do get a chance, do that tomorrow. It's fun.
I love it.
All right, I'll ignore that. That's not really my tip. But speaking of ignoring, tip number 8, ignore bye weeks early in your draft. What I mean by that is if you're drafting a running back or a receiver in the first round and then flipping positions in the second and then into the third, I know a lot of people say, well, I don't want to get people that have the same bye week. It weakens me in that week or whatever. Or some people say, I want to load up on that bye week so that I'll just have one week where I'm dead in the water, but every other week I'm fine. I say you, especially at the top of the draft, you ignore that. Take the best player, take the value play that's coming to you. Don't worry about, oh, he's got a week 4 bye, and I already have somebody that has a week 4 bye. You'll figure it out by then. Get the best players because you're trying to build the best team. The best players make the best team. The only time, and I'm not sure this even exists, the only time I would say to take bye weeks into account early would be if you truly had 2 players that are identical in your mind. But I don't think that's ever the case. No one really believes 2 guys are identical. You must have a feeling one way or another on 2 players. So ignore bye week, take the better player.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think that's even a little bit easier to do in Steel Scorpion leagues because of the fact that we're not head-to-head. In a head-to-head league, every single week is, fairly important as far as whether you win or lose. Finishing with 8 wins versus 7 wins could be the difference between making the playoffs or not. And if you have a week where you have, 3 of your main players with bye weeks and you could lose, and it could come back to haunt you. At least in our format with the all-play round-robin scoring is that if you have a week where you have some players on bye, like it's gonna hurt you, and you may finish towards the bottom, but you may finish with 3 or 4 wins instead of 7, 8, 9 wins, and so you're going to lose out on a few wins. But hopefully, over the course of 12 weeks, it won't be enough that it makes a difference. Now it could, of course, but I think you have a little bit more leeway and a little bit more wiggle room there.
Yeah, it's in a head-to-head league, as you mentioned. If I have, let's just, for argument's sake, say my 2 running backs, 2 receivers, and quarterback, between them, they all share 2 bye weeks. I'm really weak in those 2 weeks. That's a sixth of the season if you're doing a 12-week head-to-head schedule. A sixth of my season, I'm already weak from a scoring perspective. Wow, I'm probably going to lose those 2. Now I'm playing from behind. That's really dumb. Now, in an all-play format, I try and make up the ground, but I'm only, as you mentioned, I'm only going to fall to a couple wins, but I make it up by having the good weeks the rest of the time, and it's not I went 0-2 a sixth of my season. It's I got a few wins, but I had 10 wins the week before and 12 wins another week. It all evens out then. The best teams, as we've seen in Steel Scorpion, end up in the playoffs.
True, very true.
All right, what's your next tidbit?
For my next one, which unfortunately is my last one, I'm looking at the list. I wrote quite a few down here. I'm going to have to try to pick one here. So for the 9th tip, I'm going to go with my ADP tip. So ADP, if you're not aware, is average draft position. And you need to be aware of it going into the draft. You need to have an idea of where players are going, especially if certain players that you like. Ideally, if you can get some kind of cheat sheet that, ranks players by position, I'll kind of combine this with another tip I have, is, get a good cheat sheet. I like one that's arranged by position. I don't like looking at a cheat sheet of the top 300 players. To me, that does not have a whole lot of value. Like, I kind of, know in general the value of each player compared to each other, but I want to list by position because that's how I'm building my team. I need some running backs, I need some receivers, I need tight end, QB, etc. Like, that's just how I like to see it. But even all the better if you can get a list that shows by position, also shows their ADP, so that when you're going through, you can kind of see in general where those players are going, and then also shows the bye week as well, so you can kind of see that as you're drafting, not get a ton of players all at the same bye week. But back to my ADP point on this tip is that you want to be aware of the ADP of each player, but don't be beholden to it. So if you're in round 8 and you see that a player has an ADP of round 10, keep in mind that's just an average. That doesn't mean he's going in the 10th round of every draft. That means that in some drafts he's going before round 10 in some drafts he's going after. If you really like that player, you really want him on your team, don't be afraid to take him a round or two ahead of his ADP. Because if you try to wait and try to just peg to his ADP and say, okay, I've got pick 10.03 and his ADP is 10.06, you're cutting it pretty close there. If you really like him, take him in round 9. If you really, really like him, take him in round 8. Because otherwise you're going to kick yourself at the end of the draft if you didn't get him. So that's the tip. Get the players that you really want, and be aware of ADP, but also, keep in mind that that is an average.
True. That's very good advice. I'm sure everyone that is listening has heard of ADP, so hopefully that wasn't news. But I think you're right. If you're a fan of some player or it just really fits your roster well, you've planned your roster out, and as the draft is unfolding, there's a guy that you really think is good, but you think you can wait 2 more rounds. If it's really going to help you, get him now or get him the next round. So good advice, Mark. And now for my last point, my tip is, if possible, and it's not always possible, but it's a good thing I like to try and do, is if you get a quarterback, one of the, say, top 12, which I would hope in a 12-team league you did, getting his number 1 target is such a benefit. So a lot of times you'll draft the wide receiver prior to drafting the quarterback. In the first round, you may draft Antonio Brown or Demaryius Thomas or Dez Bryant. Well, that should give you a little more weight then for Peyton Manning, Big Ben, or Tony Romo. So maybe, as you were mentioning with ADP, maybe if you were planning on trying to target one of those guys, once you have their number 1 target, getting them so you double down on that and knowing that these are pass-happy offenses and this receiver is going to have a great season, well, then his quarterback is obviously throwing him the ball for that great season. I think it goes without saying, that makes a lot of sense. So you might want to adjust your ADP in your mind for a guy like Romo, if you have Dez Bryant, to try and get him. If you were going to target him anyway, pull him up around, because that bonus is worth it. And I think you've seen that as well, Mark, in your long history playing fantasy. That QB number 1 target bonus it's pretty sweet.
I love me some stacking, not just of pancakes, but stacking the QB wide receiver combo as well. When they have a touchdown pass in a game, you're getting the double points. I love it. I think there's probably 3 examples this year where it would be pretty hard to do because, like you said, you usually get the receiver first. So with the Packers and Colts, it'd be kind of hard. Obviously, Cobb and Hilton are the top 2 targets there. But based on their ADP and ADP of Luck and Rodgers, might be hard to pull that off. And then the third example where it doesn't really work is the Seahawks, because I don't know, was the number 1 target? The receiver, like Doug Baldwin, really? Like, you can get him in the 12th round, 13th round, something like that. So obviously in that case, Russell was going way, way before his number 1 target, although you should probably consider his number 1 target in reality is probably a tight end, Jimmy Graham. But his ADP is way higher than anything that I would want him for this year. But other than those 3 examples, yeah, in most cases, yeah, you get the stud wide receiver, and you probably have to end up taking the QB, going back to ADP, maybe 1 round earlier than his ADP, just to make sure that you get him and don't kind of try to play games and be tricky and wait. But I do like that doubling up.
All right, and that is our top 10. But Mark, I know you had a long list, so let's give the listeners one bonus tip going into their draft. So scan your list, figure out what's the last tip you want to leave the listeners with, and have at it.
All right, bonus time. Let's see. I'm going to go with the one that I almost did for number 9, and that is that it's better to start a positional run than to react to one. And there's basically 2 positional runs that happen in most drafts that I've seen. One is for tight ends, for the starting tight ends. You'll see some of the, look in your drafts, you're going to see Gronk obviously go probably in the first or second round. You'll see Graham go in the second or third. Olsen and Kelsey are the next 2 off the board. After that, maybe Bennett in there. After those 4 to 5 tight ends are off the board, you'll see a couple rounds go by. and then you'll see someone take a tight end, and it's going to start a run because all of a sudden people are going to realize, oh, I don't have a tight end yet, and then it's going to just boom, boom, boom. You see a bunch of tight ends in that round. Same thing with backup QBs. The starting QBs are kind of dispersed throughout the draft. You know, you see Luck and Rodgers at the top, and then Big Ben and Manning and Romo, whatever. And then teams will accumulate their starting QBs over the course of the first, 10 rounds or so. And then once you start seeing teams take a backup QB, again, it triggers the same reaction of people like, oh, no, the backup QBs are trying to go off the board. I better grab one now. I'm going to be stuck with Andy Dalton or something like that. So it's better to start that run because then, especially if you're like in the middle of a round or something, you start that run, you get your tight end or your backup QB, and then other people take all theirs, and by the time it gets back to you, so many other tight ends or backup QBs have gone off the board that you weren't going to take anyway because you already just took your backup, your tight end or your backup QB, that you're then at that point still then able to take probably the top running back or wide receiver that was on your board when you started that run. So that's what I kind of like to do when possible.
That is a great point, although I'm very upset that you had to use the Crimson Cannon, the red rifle, as your example of a quarterback, that you'll get stuck with. Some people will target him, okay?
How happy will you be if you leave tomorrow night's draft with Andy Dalton on your roster? Let me just ask you that.
I will be ecstatic. Assuming that
I will laugh at your team.
I'm saying I'll be ecstatic because I'm assuming that means he's my third quarterback who I drafted specifically to multiply in one of the first couple weeks of the season, and I must have waited really long to get him, and my top end of my roster must be so great with running back and receiver that I was able to do that, take an Andy Dalton late. So I will be ecstatic if I'm walking out with Andy Dalton in round 16.
Well, then here's to you getting Andy Dalton tomorrow. I'm all for it.
I said in round 16. I very clearly specified.
Even still.
Woohoo! Here's to me. Here's to Andy, the Crimson Cannon, the red rifle, the burgundy buck shooter.
You can have him.
Anything else? Am I missing any of his cool nicknames?
Is there a nickname related to his 0-17 playoff record? Or?
Well, luckily I won't own him at that point.
Yes.
But honestly, come on, cut the guy some slack. He's not even the worst quarterback story in the state of Ohio anymore.
And so?
Oh, I didn't say any names out loud. That was you.
Yeah.
All right, well, I think that bonus tip was worthwhile, so I'm glad we threw one extra one in there for our listeners. So everybody, good luck with your fantasy drafts. I assume they're going to start coming fast and furious here from tomorrow night all the way through the night before, or even some people go into the weekend of the first weekend of the NFL season. So good luck to you. Hopefully our tips will help you follow through. Follow along on SteelScorpionSports.com. We're going to actually have a couple podcasts coming up where we live podcast our experts draft. And we also will do a couple other podcasts that'll detail out some of our drafts. So you'll see how Mark and I were able to use these tactics and also see how certain players, certain picks, certain trends happened. So like Mark, you just mentioned, that tight end or backup QB run, we'll be able to point out where it happened in our drafts in the next week or so. So definitely come back, SteelScorpionSports.com. Also check out the leagues. We're still signing up the players for this upcoming season. We have leagues starting at $50. You can get in, use the all-play format, find out about multipliers and mulligans. You'll see, as opposed to the ESPN standard format, 10-team non-PPR league, Steel Scorpion Sports is a better way to play fantasy football, and that's why we're a better species of fantasy football. So Mark, anything you want to add before we sign off here on a Saturday night?
Just one thing. I don't know if my calculation went wrong at all, but I crunched the numbers and I found out that if you follow our 11 tips to the T, like follow them completely, my math says you have a 102% chance of winning a league. So
sounds about right. Yeah, it's the new math. I mean, the ESPN wouldn't recognize that, but I think you and I, with our war skills and our iPhones, we can compute this.
Yep.
And my old BlackBerry, it's burning up just thinking of 102%.
No, yeah, for sure.
So let's just stop right there. All right. Well, with that, we're going to sign off here. So signing off from San Diego, this is Jeff Miller.
Signing off from Santa Clara, this is Mark Eflin.
We'll talk to you later, sports fans.